The challenge is obviously with inflation, no one's immune. These multifamily operators are certainly facing that challenge. Labor costs are up and expenses are up across the board.
Welcome to BuzzHouse, a Baker Tilly podcast where you can hear all the buzz around multifamily housing, with all the info you need to help you win now and anticipate tomorrow. Hi, I'm Don Bernards, the partner in charge of Baker Tilly's multifamily housing practice.
And I'm Gary Gibson, a partner at Baker Tilly, also specializing in consulting on multifamily housing transactions across the country.
Let's get started. Back into the BuzzHouse today to give some highlights from his team's quarterly report, which covers multifamily housing among other real estate asset classes. Our guest today is Brent Maier, a colleague of ours here at Baker Tilly, who's a principal and in charge of Baker Tilly's transaction advisory. Brent, of course, for our listeners, is a repeat guest on the BuzzHouse, and we'll be talking with him today on what he and his team have observed for the second quarter of 2023 in the multifamily housing industry. Before we dive into that discussion, just a couple of quick industry news stories. HUD recently came out with a report entitled Worst Case Housing Needs, which is a report they do for Congress. The 2023 report on worst case housing needs provides national data and analyzes the critical problems facing low-income renting families. Households with worst case housing needs are very low-income renters or households with incomes at or below 50% of the area median income who do not receive government housing assistance or who pay more than one half of their income toward rent, live in severely inadequate conditions, or both. Not surprising, the 2023 report finds that in 2021, during the COVID pandemic, 8.5 million households had worst-case housing needs. This is an increase in worst-case needs from the record high of little under that, about 8.4 million in 2011, but 70% greater than the 5 million households with worst-case housing needs in 2001. So in about 20 years, we more than doubled the gap or the need for these people with worst case housing needs. In other news, the U.S. Department of Labor recently announced it would issue a final ruling updating regulations implementing the Davis-Bacon Act, which requires companies receiving federal funds for construction of some buildings to pay locally prevailing wages and benefits as determined by the Department of Labor. This is the first comprehensive rewrite of the regulations in 40 years, and the goal was to modernize and make it more efficient. So be on the lookout for that. Those of you, obviously, in the industry, certain states with tax credits, certain HUD funding, other federal funding in your multifamily projects. Now, ready to jump into the discussion with Brent. I'm going to turn it over to Garrett. Garrett?
All right. Thanks, Don, for that intro. And Brent, obviously, we do this every time, right? For those listeners who may not have been introduced to you from your last visit to BuzzHouse, why don't you just start out by letting our listeners know a little bit about your background and what you're working on at Baker Tilly's or in Baker Tilly's Transaction Advisory Group?
Yeah, sounds good. Thanks for having me back. Appreciate it, Don and Garrett. Always happy to be in the BuzzHouse. I'm our national leader for what is our real estate advisory practice, where we provide valuation and advisory services to real estate owners, investors, and users, typically in and around transactions or events, to assist those as part of their acquisition, reporting process, with services such as due diligence, feasibility, modeling, valuations, appraisals, and help around strategy.
All right. Thanks for that intro, Brent. So let's dive in. So would you be able to start out and touch on where we are at overall in the economy? How is inflation? And a topic many of our listeners are interested in is like, how did construction costs look during the second quarter?
So construction costs remained relatively flat from one quarter to the next, and inflation actually came down in Q2. Now, the Labor Department did just release the CPI this morning. It did edge up from 3.2% on an annual basis in July to 3.7% in August. Now, that's the headline number, and really what's driving that is the cost of gas. So I think if you strip that out, inflation is moderating, which is a great sign. If you look at the core inflation, it actually came down. So core inflation removes volatile energy prices, food, et cetera. That came down from 4.7 to extremely high compared to the Fed target rate of 2%. And so I think the concern is how much longer until we obtain the 2%, and what does the Fed have to do to get us to that 2%? They'll meet next week, so we should have some more clarity after next week.
Perfect. All right. So let's turn to multifamily. What pressures are operators dealing with at the moment? And we know a number of developers are noting that they're really focusing on asset management right now. Can you comment on that as well?
Yeah, I think that's consistent among our client base as well. And I think the challenge is obviously with inflation, no one's immune. These multifamily operators are certainly facing that challenge. Labor costs are up and expenses are up across the board. One line item that we've seen a substantial increase is in insurance, just with the various events going on around the country with weather-related events, et cetera. Insurance has gone up substantially, which is also due to the cost of replacing or rebuilding these structures. Insurance has gone up substantially. So yeah, our clients are focused on operations and trying to manage expenses to the best of their ability. I think the other part is also just providing a good experience to the tenants, because tenant retention is going to be important just as other units come online and are trying to compete with your property.
Thanks for that, Brent. And the talk of insurance, we actually just had a guest recently on the BuzzHouse, David Guest, and I know there are actually some hearings at Congress, and just dealing with it's uncontrollable in how we look at that. So we're seeing that all over the industry. Brent, let's now turn to rents. We saw when we talked to you last time a slowdown of rent growth in the first quarter. The newsletter talks about, again, decreasing rents, not even just a slowdown of rent growth, but even some decreasing rents in some markets. Would you be able to touch on that a little bit?
Yeah, so this is a function of supply as well as the baseline for which we're measuring our rents is quite elevated, right? So if rents went up 20% in the year prior, we're comparing a very high level rent to this year. So if the rents soften a little, I don't think there's any real concern there. Again, I think it comes back to that asset management, maintaining occupancy and the user experience. And I come back to the mantra I keep hearing is, let's stay alive until 25.
Let's stay alive till 25. Hopefully it's sooner than that, but we'll see. Brent, I think there's an interesting section of your article or your newsletter, again, really talking about where are people finding deals, new opportunities, and the newsletter touched on some unconventional sources of finding deals. Can you touch on that a little bit?
Yeah, we've seen these in various situations where these conversions of either office, industrial, or other buildings, what has to happen is the pricing has to go through a redo, right? And these assets have to get repriced. And usually there's some event or a series of events that leads to that. It's a foreclosure or some other thing that's moving in the market that allows this repricing, where you can actually pencil out and it makes sense to invest the capital to make these conversions. So I do think we'll see more of these. I'm not convinced yet that this is going to bring on a ton of supply. It will be interesting in these CBDs and urban markets where there are significant amount of office square footage and what that's going to do in those markets. Because those office users, I do think we'll see these return to work, but there's going to be a flight to quality. So it's going to be the Class C and B office buildings that are ripe for these conversions.
Thanks for that. And hopefully, obviously, if they're going to convert them, they're going to convert them to affordable housing. Don and I talk a lot about affordable housing on this podcast. And when switching gears to that, your newsletter actually addresses a couple of examples of strategies from both the private sector and the public sector to address affordability. Can you just touch on that and speak to that?
This is, given where rents have gone, inflation, we've seen a deterioration in actually the wages. So real wage growth has not maintained or kept up with inflation. So this is going to be around for some time. And I think municipalities and developers are alike are trying to solve this problem, but it's it's a traffic jam. There's just so much need that it's going to take a lot of time to process and get through. And we're just going to have to sit in rush hour until we can get through that.
Brent, one last question while we have you here, and you've maybe hit on it a little bit with the mantra of stay alive until 25, but what is your overall look, right? The multifamily asset class has been the class, right? It's been that stable class, rent growth, returns, no fear of it, but stay alive till 25, maybe what are you saying about the outlook?
Well, look, the underlying fundamentals are still solid. It's still a great asset class. I think where we see challenges are if you have a refinancing or some type of liquidity event that you've got to do in the next, call it 12 to 18 months, that's going to be a challenge. And so the transaction market may not be as active as we would like until the cost of debt regulates itself. I'm sticking with my stay alive until 25, but at the end of the day, the underlying fundamentals remain solid.
Perfect. As always, we thank Brent Maier for joining us today as we wrap up this episode of the BuzzHouse. Once again, I'm Don Bernards.
And I'm Garrett Gibson. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss an episode. For additional resources around multifamily housing, check out bakertilly.com. If you have a suggestion for the show, email us at build@bakertilly.com. That's BUILD @bakertilly.com. See you next time on BuzzHouse.